Let me tell you the tale of the Christmas miracle. A tale of how, despite all of the worst odds, Europe came together when it mattered most. Came together thanks to the brotherhood of man, prematurely ending what could have very well been the worst war in human history. In the process, propelling Europe towards closer cooperation and democracy. As legend has it, our story starts with the German Kaiser Wilhelm II. At the start of the war, a common belief was held in Germany that the Schlieffen Plan would be so successful that by Christmas, France would surrender and Germany could enforce a moderate peace deal in their favor, ending the entire affair. But, just to increase his chances, Wilhelm would pray, "God, give us the strength we need. Let this war be over by Christmas." These words would echo around the room a couple of times, before being completely forgotten by everyone. When the war broke out and Germany did indeed execute their Schlieffen Plan, they did not anticipate just how bravely Belgium would resist, slowing their offensive down. British and French forces would then manage to stabilize the front line, trench warfare would set in, and the front line stalemated. It became hopelessly clear to all, this war would be a long one. But on Christmas Eve, something truly magical would happen. Thousands of troops would leave their trenches, talking, fraternizing, and exchanging gifts with their supposed opponents. Generals on both sides were concerned, but they didn't do anything to stop it. The next day, what had been dubbed the Christmas truce would spread across the lines, essentially paralyzing the entire Western Front. The generals decided to humor the soldiers until New Year's, but on the 2nd of January, it was time to restart hostilities. Both sides would order their troops into offensives, but all offensive orders were simply ignored. Some began simply defecting, as the soldiers had stopped enforcing court-martials. The generals had fully lost control over their own forces. Initially, German leadership was quite content with the situation. They had wanted to shift focus on the Russian front anyway. But despite Germany harshly repressing news of the Christmas truce at home, socialist groups began spreading the news everywhere, believing this may be the start of a soldiers' revolution in Europe. When the news had spread to the Eastern Front, a soldiers' truce of their own began to develop. The Russians, already tired and undersupplied, took the lead here, and the German soldiers followed their example. By February of 1915, only the Ottomans and Russians were still seriously fighting each other, but it was all quiet on the other fronts. The war leaderships of both sides desperately tried to whip their soldiers back into shape, yet the soldiers quite simply refused. To make matters worse, fears and talks were growing that the soldiers may just align fully with the socialist ideals. Almost 10 million soldiers, fully mobilized, would be unstoppable if they turned around on their mother nations. Even ideas like, let's stop sending supplies to the soldiers and starve them out, would just risk igniting a full-scale revolution. Yet, despite the situation seemingly futile, Kaiser Wilhelm kept tirading in his palace. He was convinced that if only he could whip his soldiers back into shape faster, Germany could finally sweep through northern France and win the war. Against his war cabinet and close relations, he began spouting increasingly aggressive suggestions as to how he might get his soldiers back into the action. Princess Victoria Louise heard her father's words with grave concern. Her marriage to a British prince had strengthened her belief in liberal ideas, and she had welcomed the soldiers' truce, having privately denounced this useless war. She would then take a big step by starting to publicly call for the start of negotiations with the Entente and the return to peacetime democracy. This would, overnight, turn Victoria into the darling of the German people and soldiers, as she became known as the Good Royal. Behind the scenes, Germany and Britain had indeed entered secret negotiations, but they would not manage to end the conflict, as Wilhelm kept insisting on massive concessions, threatening to continue the war otherwise. A completely empty threat, as Britain knew very well that the German forces weren't fighting anymore. So, Britain sought an alternate solution, reaching out to Victoria and leveraging her marriage to Prince Ernest. The British suggested installing her as Kaiserin of Germany, so she could end the war with an agreement agreeable for all sides. Victoria considered this for days, absolutely unenthusiastic about opposing her own father. But his worsening attitude towards the striking soldiers would make up her mind. And so a plot began, combining socialist elements, the British and Princess Victoria. By March, strikes would begin spreading towards the major nations, demanding a peace be signed. One in Berlin would heavily escalate, spurred on by the British. Wilhelm, trying to portray strength, remained in his palace. But Princess Victoria would allow protesters to enter the house through a back door. After Wilhelm was put under house arrest and in a quick ceremony, Victoria was crowned the first ruling Kaiserin of the German Empire. The German elites were outraged and spoke of removing the new Kaiserin, but the support of the people and soldiers would protect her new position. Immediately after taking charge, Victoria would announce Germany's desire to formally end the war, mirrored within a day by Britain, France and Russia. The day after, a secret meeting would be called in the neutral Netherlands with only a couple attendees, amongst which the Russian Tsar, the new German Kaiserin, Kaiser Franz Joseph, French President Poincaré, the British Premier and finally King George V. These 6 most powerful figures in Europe held a secret meeting, the precise words lost to history. Yet, the day after, a full peace deal would be signed, with no immediate border changes. As far as the treaty was concerned, the war had simply never happened. Yet the following year, all sorts of changes began taking place. A new independent state would be set up, formerly known as the Franco-German Republic of Alsace-Lorraine, although the common public usually just calls it the Christmas Republic. Citizens of this new state would get dual French and German citizenship, and this Alsace Republic became the first of many new border changes as the great powers sought to sort out their differences and prevent a new conflict. In the east, Russia would set up a new independent Polish state, soon increased with German and Austrian territory as well, in a massive gesture towards peace from the Eastern empires. To satisfy the demands from the complaining war hawks in Germany, they would receive some colonial expansion from France. Besides these border readjustments, the 5 great powers, soon joined by Italy, set up Congress Europe in Strasbourg. Their goals were very simple. Ensure that all issues in Europe are arbitrated by the 6 great powers, while removing any alliances between individual great powers. Europe was not to tear itself apart. This period, confusingly, became known as the Victorian Era in Germany. After the Kaiserin, they give credit for the peace deal. All of Europe got behind the idea of talking and cooperating, rather than descending into conflict. Britain would grant complete autonomy to Ireland, making them a dominion like Canada or Australia, while the Austrians give complete autonomy to several of their minorities. But realizing that one of the main disputes over land came from nationality, another new organization was set up. The Migration Committee would come into play when no easy new border can be found. They would, subsidized by the Congress of Europe, set up safe migration routes between nations for anyone who wants to move. But still, crisis wasn't gone from Europe. One of the biggest tension points remained the Hungarian part of Austria-Hungary. The Hungarians simply refused to reform and give autonomy to their minorities. When the Austrian Kaiser attempted to force the issue, the Hungarians attempted to achieve independence from the Habsburgs. Struggling to contain the Hungarian revolt and weary of other great powers getting involved, Austria went to Congress Europe. They agreed to help, but with heavy stipulations. After the great powers overran Hungary, the Habsburgs would need to accept major reforms. In the east, Ukraine and Romania would expand slightly. Slovakia would join the Bohemian Crown, Serbia would gain the southern Slavic territories in exchange for giving up territories to Bulgaria and Albania. Italy would gain minor border territories and a Transylvanian state would be set up. The remainder of Hungary would remain a Habsburg crown. In the aftermath of these territorial changes, waves of immigration would once again attempt to sort out the ethnic violence of the region. Yet, the seemingly impossible had been accomplished, as Austria-Hungary was now a federation of equal nations. Now, it would be very childish to say that we solved all conflict with this. All sorts of expansionist movements still exist across Europe. You don't stop conflict by creating nation-states and moving people around. But, thanks to the new Congress of Europe, these disagreements didn't matter. Britain and Germany formed an unbreakable axis, threatening intervention against any European power attempting to expand. With Britain's unstoppable navy and Germany's formidable land army, these two provided quite the incentive for peace. But quite usually, Russia also aligned with these two, causing such an extreme overmight that it is doubtful that even the rest of Europe combined could have won against them. The great powers of Europe could quite simply steamroll the rest of Europe. And one of these steamrolled powers were the Ottomans. They were struggling, and at the insistence of Russia, had not been allowed to join the Congress of Europe. When a massive Arab revolt broke out in the Levant, Europe had to decide what to do. Initially, a partition of the empire was being discussed, but this broke down as disagreements got in the way, and Kaiserin Victoria began to champion the idea of self-determination, calling out European hypocrisy on the matter. So, a different plan was set up. Russian Armenia expanded as a Kurdish state was set up. The rest would be controlled by a newly created Arab state. In Europe, both Greece and Bulgaria achieved some expansion, and the old sick man had been carved up. By the late 1920s, Europe would face its final crisis to date. Tsar Nicholas had attempted to reform the nation, but the still quite powerful Russian nobility put a stop to most comprehensive reforms which could weaken their grip on the nation. Besides, many nobles were opposed to Russia's participation in the Congress Europe, arguing for a reconquest of the Polish state. Yet, the Russian people were still calling out for reform, and the growing class of urban factory workers began to weigh heavy on the Russian state. Never before were the lower classes this concentrated in their opposition to the Tsar and his nobles. A socialist revolution would rock Moscow and neighboring industrial cities, before quickly spiraling out of control, as even most of the army sided with the revolutionaries. As St. Petersburg exploded into revolution, Nicholas fled to Germany. Now the Kaiserin had wanted to support Nicholas, but was well aware of the so-called Russian question. Russia had such a population overmight that should their full transition into an industrial economy be successful, they had the potential to eclipse all other European powers. Many of the influential within Germany motioned Victoria to only support Russia in exchange for significant concessions. So, the great powers convened in Berlin, and Britain and Germany both supported a comprehensive support package for Russia, but on a couple of conditions. Finland had declared independence. This would need to be respected. Ukraine would need to become independent, the Baltics would be lost, as well as the Southern Caucasus. Moldova would be folded into Romania, and finally, and perhaps most importantly, Russia would finally become a liberal democracy, with a constitutional monarchy like the ones in Britain or Germany. These measures would suddenly cut 30% from the Russian population, making them a lot less drastically ahead of the other European populations. So, the intervention was called and presented to the people of Europe as a war for liberation and democracy, as well as an anti-communist intervention as the Bolsheviks captured more and more of Russia's heartland. The intervention was a major success, and Russia was restructured as per the agreement, as a smaller but liberal state, ready to join the world order as a proud and modern nation. Ever since this intervention, 10 years ago today, no major crises have rocked Europe. For the most part, Europe has been peaceful ever since the Christmas miracle. Europe has become richer and more integrated, making everyone wealthier as a result. The great powers of Europe, all turning democratic within this time frame, are ready to stamp out any threat to European peace. And as we speak, a new Council for Asia is also being set up, with the first item on the agenda what to do with the warlord mess that is currently tearing China apart. Germany and Britain have spoken highly of an intervention that would create a unified, democratic China, with autonomy for its minor minorities and full independence for Mongolia, Turkestan and Tibet. If this is successful, combined with the strong democracy that has already been erected in Japan, which has since released Korea as a dominion in the image of Britain and Ireland, there would be high hopes for a rich, peaceful and democratic Asia as well. Still, despite the progress being made, it would be arrogant to claim that all is well, as European colonization is still a heavy burden on the moral standing of Europe. But even here, Kaiserin Victoria is leading the decolonization society. With the help of democratic socialist victories in German elections, German colonies have received significant autonomy, with German migration to these colonies now being forbidden. Only time will tell how successful this might be, but as Britain realizes that they cannot hold on to the hundreds of millions of Indians forever, the initial drafts to turn India into a secular, autonomous, democratic dominion of Britain have gone into effect. A dominion which would share power over Britain's Asian empire with Britain itself. So, that is the world as it stands today. And I have high hopes that the world will continue to move into a richer, more democratic and more equal future. And most of all, I wish you all a Merry Christmas. I hope you enjoyed this quite unrealistic, but hopefully wholesome scenario to end the year off with. Enjoy the time with your family, and I can't wait to see you all again in 2024.